Come in, all of you." That's what a struggling single mom said to the most dangerous man in Chicago on the worst storm night of the year. Ophelia Whitaker stood in the doorway of her tiny cafe, rain hammering the street behind them, and in front of her waited 16 soaking wet figures, 15 bodyguards in black, standing in silent formation, and at their center, a man in a ruined suit whose name alone made an entire city lock its doors. Dorian Ferrante, 36 years old, rich, powerful, and feared by everyone who knew what that name meant. His convoy was stranded, the roads were flooded, and every other business on that street had already killed their lights the moment his men stepped out of those black SUVs. 2 gas stations turned him away. A diner pulled down its shutters while his people stood shivering in the rain. Nobody in that city would open a door for the Ferrante name at midnight. Nobody except a young mother with a small cafe, a sleeping little girl in the back room, and every reason in the world to say no. But she didn't say no. She stepped aside and let them in. She had no idea who she was letting into her life that night, and she couldn't have imagined that by the next morning, her failing little cafe would be changed completely in ways she wouldn't have dared to dream of. What happened inside that cafe during those long storm hours? And what did the most feared man in Chicago do when the sun came up? If this story touches your heart, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Share it with someone who still believes kindness matters. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We read every single one. Now, let's go back to the beginning of that stormy night, to the moment before the engines came, when Ophelia Whitaker thought closing up her cafe was the hardest thing she'd have to do that day. At 9 o'clock on Wednesday night, Ophelia Whitaker had exactly 3 things left to do before she was allowed to call the day over. Lock the back door, turn off the coffee machine, count the register. Only 3 things stood between her and a dinner, reheated in the microwave, a stack of unopened bills, and the sleep of someone who had been on her feet since 5 o'clock that morning. She started with the easiest one. The back door locked with a turn of her wrist that had long since become instinct. Then she went back inside, switched off the coffee machine, and wiped the steam wand with a cloth so worn it was nearly transparent. Last came the register. She pressed the button, and the drawer sprang open with a small, cheerful chime that felt almost cruel in its irony. And she counted what remained from a full day of business. $43. She counted it a second time, not because she hoped the number might somehow change, but because her grandmother had always told her to count twice before trusting any number. $43, after 16 hours with the doors open, after all those cups of coffee sold to the plumbers and the nurses coming off the night shift in this part of Bridgeport. She slipped the money into a cloth bag, pulled the zipper shut, and tried not to look toward the paper posted behind the counter. She looked anyway. She always did. The notice was printed on Price Realty letterhead, its wording coldly polite, informing her that she had 30 days to accept the offer to purchase the building, or prepare for the proceedings that would follow. 30 days. Today was already the 9th. Beneath the notice, held by the same paperclip, was a letter from the debt collection company, the only legacy Wade Cutler had left his former wife and daughter before disappearing out west with his truck and every dollar of their shared savings. Ophelia didn't tear those papers down. She kept them where she could see them every day, because she was the kind of person who would rather face a problem head-on than let it stalk her from behind. She switched off the row of lights above the counter, leaving only the small lamp in the corner glowing, then walked toward the back room where Maisie was waiting. The little girl wasn't waiting. She had fallen asleep at some point, curled up on the old sofa pushed against the wall, her math workbook open across her lap, the pencil still resting loosely between her tiny fingers. The 4th problem was unfinished, the number written only halfway before trailing off, as though sleep had found her in the middle of an addition problem. Ophelia knelt beside her daughter, gently slipped the pencil from her hand, closed the workbook, and placed it on the table. She stood there for a moment, watching her little girl, 7 years old, her hair tangled from the sofa cushion, her long lashes casting shadows across her cheeks, sleeping so deeply that she didn't move at all when her mother took off her own coat and laid it over her. Maisie had been used to sleeping at the coffee shop since before she could walk, so used to it that this sofa was a bed to her, and this shop was a home. Ophelia brushed a strand of hair away from her forehead, then softly told the empty room that she needed only 5 more minutes, and once she had locked up, she would carry her out to the car. She walked back through the main room, passing the wall where a framed photograph had faded with age. In it, a silver-haired woman with her hair swept into a high bun stood behind this very counter, one hand resting on a gleaming brass coffee machine, her mouth curved into the smile Ophelia could still hear in her memory. Grandma Pearl, the woman who had named the shop, the woman who had built it, the woman everyone in the neighborhood had once simply called the old lady on the corner. Directly beneath the photograph hung a small blackboard, and written across it in the careful chalk lettering, Ophelia traced again, whenever the words began to fade, was the sentence her grandmother had left behind, along with the shop. The measure of a person's heart is how they treat someone who can never repay them. Ophelia had read those words thousands of times. Tonight, she read them once more, her gaze passing over them like a hand touching something familiar, then stepped toward the main light switch beside the front door. Outside, rain was pouring over Bridgeport, as though the sky owed the earth a debt it had finally come to repay. Water streamed down the window panes, and the streetlights blurred into trembling halos of yellow. She placed her hand on the switch, and at that exact moment, through the roar of the rain, she heard it. Engines. Not one vehicle, several of them, low and heavy, the powerful growl of large machines slowing down, tires cutting through the water as they entered her narrow street, drawing closer and closer, until one by one, they stopped directly in front of the coffee shop. She opened the door for them, and 16 drenched men crossed the threshold of Pearl's Corner one after another, carrying the chill of the storm into the lingering scent of coffee at the end of the day. The first thing that made Ophelia freeze wasn't their number. It was their order. No one shoved. No one stepped on another man's foot. No one raised his voice. They entered in a line, then separated into small groups along the walls as though they had rehearsed it beforehand. The wettest among them guided farther inside toward the warmth, while those still steady on their feet remained near the windows like a shield. No one pulled out a chair before looking at the man standing in the center of the room. He hadn't sat down. He stood there in a black suit, ruined by rainwater, his wet hair clinging to his forehead, and his eyes moved slowly around the shop in a way Ophelia had never seen in any customer before, careful and deliberate, taking note of every door, every pane of glass, every passage, like a man reading a map rather than looking at a coffee shop. He didn't say a word to her. No thank you, no introduction, only the slightest nod, so faint it was almost nothing. Then he withdrew to the table in the farthest corner, where both the front and back doors were visible, and sat down. The largest man in the group, with shoulders as broad as a wardrobe and a head shaved smooth, didn't sit with anyone. He made his way around the shop with steps strangely light for a body of that size, stopping first at the back door, testing the knob, looking through the small pane of glass, then moving to the door that led down to the basement, and afterward to each window, one by one, checking every latch with 2 fingers. When he was finished, he chose a position between the front entrance and the corner table, stood there with his arms at his sides, and didn't move again. None of them revealed anything beneath their coats. But that organized silence, that division of duties carried out without a single spoken command, told Ophelia more than anything she could have imagined. She caught fragments of a conversation, brief and quiet, between 2 men standing near the counter. One said that 2 vehicles were completely dead, water in the engines, and the remaining one had 2 blown tires. The other replied that Halstead was flooded knee-deep, the bridge to the south had been closed, and the police had blocked the detour as well. The first man asked about hotels, and the second answered in a voice that dropped even lower. No hotels, no cameras, nowhere with a guest register. Not tonight. Those were the orders. Then, both men fell silent when they realized she was standing close enough to hear. Ophelia decided she didn't need to understand. She needed to work. She went behind the counter, turned on the stove she had shut down less than half an hour earlier, took the remaining pot of soup from the refrigerator, and set it over the flame. Then she measured out coffee, twice the usual amount, poured in the water, pressed the button, and while she waited, she arranged every clean cup the shop had, 30 cups for 16 men, dripping rainwater onto her floor. When the first pot was ready, she began to pour, and she realized her hand was trembling. Not much, only enough for the dark coffee to ripple against the rim of the cup, only enough that she had to set the pot down for a second, breathe in, breathe out, then continue. She carried the first tray of cups into the room, placed it on the long table in the center of the shop, and told them in the calmest voice she could gather that the coffee was hot. The soup would be ready in 10 minutes, and anyone who was too cold could move closer to the heater, because it was old but it still worked. For 1 second, no one moved. 16 pairs of eyes looked at her, then shifted toward the corner table. The man sitting there gave a small nod. Only then did hands reach for the cups, and the first words of thanks began to rise through the room. Low, rough, almost embarrassed, as though it had been a very long time since anyone had handed these men something without attaching a price to it. A woman separated herself from the group, standing straight, her hair tied neatly at the back of her neck, and came to the counter. She looked at the pot of soup, then at the stack of bowls, then at Ophelia, and asked in a voice touched by a foreign accent softened by the passing years whether she might take care of the kitchen, because Ophelia shouldn't have to serve this many people alone. Ophelia started to refuse out of the reflex of someone who had grown accustomed to doing everything herself. But the woman had already rolled up her sleeves, and there was such practiced ease in the gesture that any refusal became unnecessary. Ophelia nodded. In the corner of the room, a younger man lowered himself into a chair, his left arm already wrapped in bandages, the fabric soaked through with rain, while one of his companions quietly helped replace it with a dry roll taken from an inner pocket. No one explained. Ophelia didn't ask. She simply poured another cup of coffee, set it beside the injured man, and returned to the pot of soup, which had begun to send warmth and steam through the small kitchen. By the time half the pot of soup was gone, voices had begun to rise inside the shop. They didn't come all at once. They seeped in slowly, like the warmth from the old heater struggling in the corner, and strangely enough, the one who opened the way for them was the youngest man in the group. He accepted a bowl of soup from the woman with her hair tied neatly back, took one spoonful, then let out a groan of pure pleasure so loud that half the room turned to look at him. Embarrassed, he lifted the spoon in apology, then announced to the entire shop that he swore it was the best thing he had ever eaten in his life, and that if anyone planned to tell the story later, they should please make sure to include the part where Toby nearly cried over a bowl of chicken soup. A few muffled chuckles came from somewhere along the wall. Toby, 23 years old, by his own declaration to anyone willing to listen, went on proving that he was the greatest danger to himself that night. He stood to get more bread and struck his knee against the leg of the table, apologized to the table, then dropped his spoon and caught it in midair with the pride of a man who had just performed some heroic deed. The woman at the kitchen counter called his name in the voice of someone long accustomed to cleaning up the consequences, and told Toby to sit still and eat like a human being. He sat down. The whole room laughed again, more easily this time. The woman's name was Petra. Ophelia learned when one of the men called her over to examine his numb, frost-bitten hand, and Ophelia noticed that Petra wasn't serving food according to where anyone stood in line. She moved among the small groups, studying each face, pressing the back of her hand to several men's necks, then deciding who would eat first, who needed hot tea instead of coffee, and who had to remove his wet coat immediately without argument. The men who were trembling most ate first, while the young and strong waited until last, and no one questioned her for even half a second. When Ophelia brought out more bread, Petra took the tray from her and said, half in explanation and half as an order, that she should leave it to her because she had fed rooms far worse than this one. Ophelia didn't ask what a worse room meant. What surprised her most was the enormous man guarding the door. For an entire hour, he had stood motionless, as though he were part of the building itself. Yet while she was gathering dirty cups, a hand the size of a dinner plate reached out and lifted the stack from her arms. He said nothing. He carried the cups to the sink, picked up a cleaning cloth, and began wiping the tables one by one, carefully and slowly, returning every sugar jar and napkin holder to its original place, with precision down to a fraction of an inch. Toby watched him, forgetting to chew, then whispered to the man beside him that he had never seen Bull wipe down a table before, and he hadn't even known Bull knew how. Without turning around, Bull answered in a voice as deep as a rolling metal door that his mother had run a diner for 30 years. And when you finished eating, you cleaned up. Toby immediately stood and began collecting plates, and through all of it, the man at the corner table took part in nothing. He sat with a cup of coffee that was still more than 2/3 full, and his eyes worked. Ophelia could feel that gaze moving through the shop like the slow sweep of a searchlight. It stopped on the notice posted behind the counter, long enough to read every line printed by the price company. It stopped on the cracked window, held together with strips of clear tape, on the second heater, sitting lifeless beneath the window because she hadn't been able to afford repairs since the beginning of the season, on the stain across the ceiling where the roof leaked, and on the worn heels of her own shoes. Nothing in the shop escaped those eyes, and Ophelia understood that she was being read, one page at a time, by a man who knew how to read very well. Near midnight, when she carried the coffee pot over to refill his cup, the man spoke for the first time. His voice was low and calm, not as cold as she had expected, but without a single unnecessary note in it. He asked whether she knew that every other door on the street had closed when they saw them. She said she did. He turned his cup slightly on the table, looked at her, and asked why she had opened hers. Ophelia stood there with the coffee pot in her hand, and she realized she didn't need to think. The answer had already been waiting inside her long before he asked the question. "Because you were standing in the rain," she said. That was all. The man looked at her for another moment, just a little longer than politeness required, as though waiting for the rest of the answer, the part with conditions attached, the part that wanted something in return, and found nothing there. Not once that entire night had she asked who they were. He gave a slight nod, said nothing more, and Ophelia returned to the counter, unaware that behind her, those eyes were still following her, and this time they were no longer reading the shop. They were reading her. At 11:15, the door to the back room eased open, and Maisie Whitaker appeared in the doorway with one side of her hair flattened from sleep, her mother's coat still draped loosely over her shoulders, and her socks pulled on crooked. She stood there rubbing her eyes, blinking at a room that had changed completely since she had fallen asleep. A quiet coffee shop now filled with tall men dressed in black, the smell of chicken soup, the scent of fresh coffee, and wet coats hanging over the backs of chairs. The conversation inside the shop softened, then faded away entirely. 16 men whom the entire city avoided looking directly in the eye, suddenly had no idea what to do in front of a 7-year-old child wearing uneven socks. Ophelia set down the coffee pot and started toward her daughter, but Maisie had already stepped into the room on her own, her wide eyes moving slowly across everything, in exactly the way she always studied something new, without hurry, missing nothing, as though she were taking inventory. She looked at the wet shoes arranged in a neat row near the door. She looked at Petra standing behind the kitchen counter with a ladle in her hand. She looked at the largest man in the room holding a cleaning cloth that seemed tiny against the size of his hand. Then she lifted her face toward her mother and asked in a voice still rough with sleep whether the men's cars had broken down. Ophelia said yes, most of them had, and the rain was so heavy that they had stopped there for shelter, so she was helping them with a little hot food. Maisie nodded as though this were the most reasonable thing in the world, thought for another second, then asked whether they had been given any cookies yet. Without waiting for an answer, she turned back into the rear room and returned carrying the tin of oatmeal cookies she and her mother had baked over the weekend, holding it in both arms, then began making her way around the shop, stopping in front of each person, lifting the lid, and offering it out. One by one, large hands reached into the tin, careful as though afraid they might break something, and words of thanks followed one after another, awkward, quiet, and sincere. When the tin reached Toby, he accepted a cookie with both hands and bowed his head solemnly, as though receiving a medal, then declared that it was the greatest honor of his life. Maisie studied him with the serious judgment only a child could possess, and asked what his name was. He told her his name was Toby. She asked whether Toby was his real name or only what people called him. He admitted that his real name was Tobias, but it sounded terribly old, so no one should ever call him that. Maisie considered this, then pronounced that Tobias sounded like the name of a wizard in a book, while Toby sounded like the name of a good dog, and both were acceptable. The whole shop burst into laughter, and Toby sat there with the cookie in his hand, unsure whether he should feel proud or argue. The little girl continued on her way, past Petra, who accepted a cookie and praised her and her mother for baking so well, past Bull, who held the tiny cookie between 2 fingers and thanked her in a voice so deep that Maisie had to tilt her head all the way back and study his face for a moment, and finally, the tin stopped in front of the table in the corner. Without anyone giving an order, the room fell another degree quieter. The man sitting there looked at the child standing before him, and the child looked back, completely unaware that throughout the city, there were grown men who rehearsed in their minds what they planned to say before approaching any table where he sat. Maisie lifted the lid, tilted the tin toward him, and said he hadn't had a cookie yet. There were 2 left, and he could take the bigger one if he wanted. He looked into the tin, then he reached out slowly and took the smaller cookie. Maisie nodded with approval, as though he had just passed some test known only to her, then asked what his name was. Across the shop, Ophelia stopped with the cloth still in her hand. A moment of silence stretched out, weightless to the child but heavy for every adult in the room. Then the man spoke, his voice still low, though something in it had changed. He said his name was Dorian. No surname, no title. None of the name that still made people lower their voices whenever they spoke it. Only one bare name, perhaps introduced that way by him for the first time in many years. Maisie said Dorian also sounded like a name from a book. Then, with the sudden generosity of a child, she placed the final cookie on the table beside his hand, told him to save it for any friend who hadn't received one, and walked back toward her mother. Near the counter, Bull stopped wiping the table. He looked toward the elderly, silver-haired man who had sat quietly near the window all night, the man the others called Mr. Aldo with a respect that required no explanation. And the two men exchanged a long, wordless glance, the look of people who had just witnessed something neither of them was ready to name. Maisie climbed onto the bench beside the heater, announced that she was only going to lie down for a little while, and fell asleep again in less than 3 minutes. A short time later, one of the men quietly left his seat, took the only dry coat remaining in his bag, and laid it over the little girl, carefully drawing the edge down to cover her crookedly socked feet, then returned to his place without saying a word to anyone. At the corner table, Dorian Ferrante sat looking at the small cookie in his hand for a long while, then ate it slowly, down to the final crumb. The remaining cookie, the one meant for any friend who hadn't received one, he wrapped in a clean paper napkin and slipped into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, close against his chest, in the place where people kept the things they had no intention of giving to anyone. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Pearl's Corner settled into a kind of silence it had never known before. The silence of a room filled with sleeping people. Outside, the rain had spent most of its anger, and now fell in a steady rhythm against the roof. Someone near the window was snoring softly. Toby slept sitting up with his back against the wall, still clutching his empty cup as though he were afraid someone might take it away. Petra had turned down most of the burners, leaving only a small flame beneath the final pot of tea to keep it warm. Ophelia didn't sleep. She sat on the chair behind the counter, with both hands wrapped around a cup of tea, so exhausted that she had passed beyond the point of feeling sleepy, and that was when she realized the silver-haired man had somehow come to stand in front of the wall where the photograph hung. Mr. Aldo. 68 years old, if she had guessed correctly. Thin and straight-backed. The kind of man who grew old without bending beneath it. All night he had sat near the window, eating little, saying even less, simply watching, and now he was studying the photograph of Grandma Pearl with such concentration that Ophelia set down her cup and walked toward him. He heard her footsteps but didn't turn at once. In a voice slow and rough like old paper, he asked who the woman in the photograph was. "My grandmother," Ophelia answered. "Grandma Pearl. The shop was named after her." Mr. Aldo gave the faintest nod, his eyes still fixed on the photograph, then lifted one finger, not touching the glass, only pointing toward the brass coffee machine beside Grandma Pearl in the picture. The machine with its curving pipes and the small eagle cast into the top, and he asked about the machine. Ophelia was silent for a moment. "That was the Vittoria," she said. "My grandmother brought it here decades ago, back when the neighborhood was completely different. It came by ship and took almost 3 months to arrive. She said there wasn't another one like it anywhere in Chicago back then," Mr. Aldo asked, still in that same even voice. Where it was now. The question fell into the shop like a pebble dropped into a well, and Ophelia could hear its echo inside her chest. She could have given him a short answer. She had a dozen short answers, practiced over 3 years, answers that skimmed across the truth quickly enough that no one had time to see what lay beneath them. But the night had already been too long, and this man had asked in the voice of someone who truly wanted to know, and at the corner table, she knew without turning to look that Dorian was still awake and listening. "I sold it," she said. Her voice was even and flat, held steady by an effort she hoped no one could see. 3 years ago. My grandmother raised me from the time I was 9, after my mother died. She taught me everything right behind this counter. And when she passed away, she left me the shop, the name on the sign, and that machine. She paused and drew in a breath instead of taking a sip of tea. Then my daughter got sick. Emergency surgery in the middle of the night. No insurance. My husband had just left, taking our savings with him and leaving debts in my name. The hospital couldn't wait, and I had exactly one thing in my life worth the amount they told me I had to pay. A collector named Harold Bishop offered a good price. He arrived in a white truck with 3 men to carry it out. They wrapped the machine in gray blankets, and I stood right here and signed the papers. The shop was so quiet that the changing rhythm of the rain on the roof could be heard. Mr. Aldo asked, gently, like a hand being placed on her shoulder, whether she had ever regretted it. No, Ophelia said, and this time her voice was stronger. My little girl is healthy. She's sleeping right over there with a kind stranger's coat covering her. I'd sell 100 more machines if I had to make that choice again. She looked up at the photograph, at the gleaming brass machine beneath her grandmother's hand. But that machine was the only thing left that still carried the smell of my grandmother's coffee. I know selling it was the right decision. Knowing that doesn't mean it stopped hurting. No one said anything. No words of comfort were offered, and Ophelia was grateful for that, because the people in this room seemed to understand that some stories weren't told, so the person telling them could be soothed. They were told simply so they could be set down once, among people who knew how to listen. She bent to pick up a cup someone had left on the floor, and when she straightened, she saw that Mr. Aldo still hadn't looked away from the photograph. He studied it for a long time, far longer than politeness required, in the way a person looked at something not to discover what it was, but to confirm something he already knew. His right hand closed lightly, then opened again. Then he said, almost to himself, Pearl, and stopped there, letting the name stand alone in the air for another second. A beautiful name. He wished her good night, though no one intended to sleep, then slowly returned to his chair near the window. Ophelia carried the cup back to the counter, telling herself that old men often looked at old photographs that way, that it meant nothing. But at the table in the corner, Dorian Ferrante had witnessed that look from beginning to end, and he, a man who had survived this long by knowing how to read the things other people left unspoken, gently set his cold coffee on the table and shifted his gaze from the old man to the photograph, then back to the old man again, with the expression of someone who had just seen the first piece move across a chessboard he hadn't even known existed. The rain stopped at around 6 o'clock in the morning, as suddenly as though someone had turned off a valve, and the first light of day slipped through the wet window panes, gray and clean, falling across 16 men as they woke one by one inside the small coffee shop in Bridgeport. They rose in the same way they had entered, orderly and sparing with words, one folding a borrowed blanket, another returning a chair to its exact place, another washing his own cup in the sink even after Petra told him to leave it there. Phones began vibrating somewhere inside coat pockets. Brief calls were answered with only a few words, and by a little before 7 o'clock, 2 tow trucks and 3 brand-new black SUVs were lined up outside the shop, their windshield wipers still sweeping away the final drops of rain. The floodwater had receded. The bridge to the south had reopened. The world outside was demanding their return. Ophelia boiled the last of the eggs in the kitchen and insisted that every man take one along with a slice of bread. And strangely enough, not one of them dared refuse, not even those who looked as though they had never once in their lives been told that refusal wasn't an option. Toby said goodbye to Maisie, who was eating breakfast on the bench, solemnly shook her hand, and told her that if she ever opened a cookie shop, he wanted to register as her very first customer, while Maisie replied that she would have to think about it, because the first customer needed to be someone serious. Bull placed the neatly folded cleaning cloth on the counter, like a soldier returning a piece of issued equipment. Petra took Ophelia's hand between both of hers and said nothing lengthy, only squeezed it very tightly. Then, when the shop was nearly empty, and the engines outside were humming steadily as they waited, Dorian Ferrante rose from the corner table, walked to the counter, and placed a stack of money on the wooden surface. The bundle was thick, folded in half and held with a rubber band, every bill a large denomination, thick enough that Ophelia didn't need to count it to know it was more than half a year of the shop's revenue, thick enough to settle the collection letter behind the counter in full, and still leave enough to speak with the price company. He set it down without display, without emphasis, simply placed it there as though returning something to where it belonged, then said it was for last night, for the food, for the shelter, for her trouble. The entire shop, including the few people still standing near the door, went silent. Ophelia looked at the money. She looked at it long enough for every number in her life to march through her mind. The 30-day notice, the $43 in the register, the unopened bills inside the cloth bag. Then she laid her hand on the bundle and pushed it firmly back toward him, without trembling, until it rested entirely on his side of the counter. "You needed a place to shelter," she said. "I had one. My grandmother built this shop for that very purpose." She said nothing more, offered no explanation, delivered no sermon. And it was the simplicity of those words that made them stand like a wall. Dorian looked at her. Behind him, his men had gone still, and on their faces was an expression Ophelia couldn't understand at the time, the look of people who had just witnessed something that had never happened before, because in the world they lived in, no one refused this man's money, and no one pushed anything back toward Dorian Ferrante. 1 second passed. Then 2. At last, Dorian picked up the bundle, returned it to the inside pocket of his suit jacket, and gave her a slow nod. And for the first time in 12 hours, something close to respect appeared openly in his eyes, without concealment. He thanked her in exactly 2 words, no more, then turned toward the door. The others followed one by one, and Mr. Aldo was the last to leave. The old man moved more slowly than all the rest, and when he passed the wall, he stopped in front of the blackboard beneath Grandma Pearl's photograph. He stood there reading the words written in white chalk. The measure of a person's heart is how they treat someone who can never repay them, reading them with his eyes and perhaps with his lips as well, the way someone rereads an old letter discovered in a drawer. Then he walked toward the door, where Dorian stood waiting for him, and before crossing the threshold, the old man tilted his head toward the younger man and spoke one sentence, very brief and very low, completely swallowed by the sound of engines in the street. Ophelia, standing behind the counter with a stack of plates in her hands, saw only what followed. She saw Dorian's shoulders pause for half a beat. She saw him turn and look at Mr. Aldo for one long second, then glance toward the courtyard in search of Bull and give him a nod, so brief that a person could have missed it with a blink, something she assumed was merely a farewell between men who rarely spoke. Bull looked back, and something in his posture changed, like a machine that had just been given a task. Then the vehicle doors closed one after another, and the convoy of black cars rolled away from the narrow street, leaving Pearl's Corner behind with its floor wiped dry by someone, its chairs arranged in straight rows, and a silence that somehow sounded larger than usual. Maisie asked whether the men had gone, and Ophelia said yes, they were gone, then stood there for another moment looking out at the empty street, thinking that it was over, that this would forever remain the strangest story of her life to tell someday, that she would never see any of those people again. She was wrong. At 7 o'clock the next morning, Ophelia drove Maisie to school, and then headed back to the shop as she did every day, her mind still foggy from a night with almost no sleep, and she had to slam on the brakes halfway down the street because 3 white box trucks were parked in front of Pearl's Corner, along with nearly a dozen workers in protective gear waiting outside, some with their arms folded, some leaning against ladders, and others unloading new panes of glass, still covered in protective paper, onto the sidewalk. She stepped out of the car with her heart beating out of rhythm, certain there had been some mistake with the address, but the oldest man in the crew came toward her carrying a clipboard, asked whether she was the owner, then showed her a work order already printed with the name of the shop and the street address, with the words paid in full outlined in bold in one corner. "Replace the entire roof," he said in the voice of a man who simply followed paperwork. "Install a new heating system. Replace the 2 front windows, and repaint the sign in the exact original lettering." The client made it clear that the style of the letters wasn't to be changed. It had to remain exactly as the old woman had written it years ago. Ophelia asked which client, who had hired them, and the man shrugged and said the contract had been arranged through a management company. The money had already been transferred in full, and all he knew was that they were expected to finish the work and make it beautiful, so if she would allow them to begin, they wouldn't lose the morning. For the rest of that day, her little coffee shop became a construction site run, with almost unbelievable discipline. Workers climbed onto the roof and removed the rotting shingles one section at a time, the same roof she had kept from leaking with buckets and bowls through 2 winters. And by afternoon, the spreading stain on the ceiling, the mark she had looked up at every day as though it were another debt, had disappeared beneath a new ceiling painted a clean, flawless white. The cracked window, held together with clear tape, was lifted out with its entire frame and replaced by thick double-pane glass. And when the worker wiped away the last fingerprint, sunlight poured into the shop in a way Ophelia had forgotten it was capable of doing. The heater that had been dead since the beginning of the season was carried away, replaced by a new system so quiet that she had to press her hand against it before she believed it was running. And high above the sidewalk, 2 workers carefully repainted every letter on the Pearl's Corner sign, following the exact slanting strokes her grandmother had drawn by hand decades earlier, without missing a single curve. And that wasn't all. In the middle of the morning, a delivery truck pulled up, and the driver unloaded cardboard boxes printed with the name of a coffee importer Ophelia had only ever dared admire online: premium roasted beans, along with sugar, flour, milk, and everything a proper coffee shop needed. And when she waved her hands and insisted that she hadn't ordered any of it and couldn't possibly afford it, the driver checked his device again and showed her the screen. The shop's account had been prepaid for 6 months, with deliveries scheduled every week, and if she wanted to change any of the items, she only had to call. She stood there on the sidewalk amid the sound of hammers and saws and the smell of fresh paint, asking whether there was an invoice, and the driver handed her a printed sheet. There was no buyer's name, no business card, no telephone number, not even a signature. Only on the final line reserved for notes, where there should have been nothing, was a single sentence: payment for 1 bowl of soup. Ophelia read the words 3 times. She folded the invoice, slipped it into her coat pocket, and had to turn toward the street for a moment because her eyes were doing something she refused to let them do in front of that many strangers. That afternoon, after the workers had left and the newly restored shop still carried the scent of paint, she sat down intending to catch her breath, then remembered that today was the deadline the Price Company's law office had set for calling her back to finalize her answer about the building, the call that had kept her awake all week. The telephone remained silent. She waited until 4 o'clock, then 5. No one called. At last, she dialed the office herself, already bracing for the familiar, syrupy voice of the lawyer who never failed to remind her how many days she had left. But instead she received an answer from a receptionist who sounded as though she were reading from a prepared script, explaining that the file connected to her address had been temporarily placed on hold, that no new deadline had been established, and that they would contact her if further information became available. Thank you for calling. On hold. After 9 months of relentless letters, after bold 30-day deadlines, suddenly everything was on hold, brief and without explanation. Ophelia set the telephone down on the wooden counter, which someone had polished until it gleamed, and stood motionless in the middle of her shop for a very long time. All around her, everything was whole in the way she had dreamed of during those nights, spent adding up the books, the white ceiling, the clear glass, the warmth moving evenly beneath the floor, the sign outside carrying her grandmother's handwriting as though it had been made young again. This was a miracle, one half of her said, the half that wanted to kneel down in gratitude. But the other half, the half that had lived long enough to know that nothing in this world came free, kept staring at the invoice with no buyer's name, kept thinking about the way an aggressive law office had suddenly fallen silent after a single night, and that half whispered that an enormous hand had just spread itself over this shop, a hand large enough to change the color of her entire sky. And she didn't even know where to send her gratitude or where she ought to begin being afraid. 1 week later, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon with few customers, the door of the shop opened, and Dorian Ferrante walked in alone, with no convoy and no bodyguards, only a black sedan parked across the street, and a man in a charcoal gray suit standing at the counter, ordering an espresso. Ophelia stood behind the coffee machine and realized that once again, her hand needed to be reminded to remain still. He accepted his coffee, paid with small bills like any ordinary customer, dropped the change into the tip jar, then walked to the table in the corner, the same table from the stormy night, sat down with a newspaper folded into quarters, and stayed there for about 40 minutes before leaving with a slight nod. No explanation. No mention of the new roof or the freshly painted sign. 3 days later, he came again, at the same hour, to the same table, ordering the same espresso. Then, twice more the following week, and little by little, the presence of the man at the corner table became part of the shop's routine, as regular as the bell above the door, as quiet as a piece of furniture that knew how to breathe. And during those weeks, one fragment at a time, Ophelia completed the picture she had avoided putting together since the night of the storm. One evening, the local news reported on a hearing involving contracts at the city's ports, and the camera passed over a row of seats, pausing for half a second on a face she knew, while the name Ferrante appeared beneath it. A surname the news anchor pronounced in the careful tone people reserved for things best spoken quietly. She stood in the middle of her living room with a plate of food growing cold in her hands. Then she began noticing the eyes of the neighborhood, the way the owner of the laundromat across the street looked at the black sedan and then at her, asking no questions, though her expression contained an entire paragraph, the way the 2 loiterers who used to lean near the corner and intimidate people for money suddenly disappeared from the neighborhood as though they had never existed. The way the street police cruisers rarely bothered to enter, became quiet with an orderliness that felt arranged. She understood, and she was afraid, truly afraid, with a metallic taste in her mouth, the kind of fear that made her stand beside Maisie's bed for long stretches at night, simply to listen to her daughter breathe, wondering what she had allowed to walk into their lives when she opened that door. She rehearsed the words, "Please don't come here anymore," in her mind, no fewer than a dozen times. But every afternoon the man arrived. He did only one thing. He drank his coffee, read his newspaper, paid his bill, left a tip, and the distance he maintained with precision, down to the smallest fraction of an inch, the way he asked for nothing, caused those words to dissolve before they could ever be spoken. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, every defense she had built was breached by her own daughter. Maisie was sitting at the table beside the window doing her homework as usual, pulling at her hair in frustration over division with remainders, and before Ophelia could wipe her hands and go help, the little girl had already slid down from her chair, hugged her workbook to her chest, walked straight to the corner table, and asked the man sitting there whether he knew how to divide, because her mother was busy, and the problem was terribly difficult. Ophelia opened her mouth to call her daughter back, but Dorian had already set down his newspaper, pulled out the chair opposite him with one foot, and told her to let him take a look. And then Ophelia stood behind the counter and watched the man whose name made an entire city lower its voice bend over a second-grade workbook. Listen as her daughter explained the problem incorrectly, with all the confidence in the world, and patiently, with a patience she never would have imagined. Arrange sugar cubes from the jar into small groups across the tabletop to show the child that division was really nothing more than sharing candy evenly. He didn't solve it for her. He made Maisie count for herself, make mistakes for herself, discover the answer for herself, and when she cried out, because she finally understood, he gave one solemn nod, as though she had just completed a serious business transaction. From that afternoon on, Maisie called him Uncle Dorian, as naturally as though he were a neighbor, and every time the black sedan parked across the street, she lifted her head from her homework with an anticipation she made no effort to hide. Ophelia knew she should put a stop to it. She knew, and she didn't, and she was angry with herself for not doing so. One afternoon near the end of the month, Maisie spent nearly an hour working over her box of colored pencils, the tip of her tongue pressed to one corner of her mouth in concentration, then carried a drawing to the corner table. In the picture was a small building with a crooked sign reading Pearl's Corner. The sky above it crowded with blue streaks of rain, and in front of the door stood 16 stick figures gathered close together, all colored black, all drawn with smiling mouths, while in the doorway stood a blonde figure raising one hand in greeting. "I drew the rainy night," the little girl said. "See if you can find which one is you." Dorian took the drawing and studied it far longer than adults usually studied a child's picture, then pointed to the stick figure standing farthest away in the corner. Maisie cried out that he was right, and asked how he knew. He didn't answer that question. He folded the drawing carefully into quarters along precise creases, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket over the left side of his chest, then said exactly 2 words to her, "Thank you," in a voice Ophelia, standing behind the counter pretending to polish a cup that had been dry for a long time, had never heard him use with anyone else. On Friday night that week, Maisie spent the night at a classmate's house for the first time in her life, and perhaps because the shop felt so empty without the little girl, everything Ophelia had kept pressed down inside herself over the past several weeks suddenly had nowhere left to go. At 9 o'clock, she turned the sign to closed, and when she looked back, the final customer was still sitting at the corner table with his second espresso gone cold. She stopped cleaning. She poured herself a glass of water, crossed the room, pulled out the chair opposite him, and sat down for the first time since the night of the storm. Dorian folded his newspaper without showing surprise, as though he had been waiting for this conversation for a long time and had only wondered why it had taken so long to arrive. Ophelia wrapped both hands around the glass to give them something to do, then asked without preamble what kind of man he was outside that door. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't laugh it off, change the subject, or do any of the things men usually did when they were asked a question they didn't want to answer. He looked at her for a moment, and in that look she could see him deciding something. Then he said in a voice as flat as a weather report that he was the man this entire city feared. He let the words rest between them without decoration or apology, then added, "Except for the 2 people in this room." Ophelia could hear her heartbeat in her throat. She had wanted him to deny it. She realized that at that very moment, that through all those weeks, some part of her had been hoping for the day he would deny it, offer an explanation easy enough for her to believe, and with 3 seconds of honesty, he had taken that escape away from her. "So what people say is true?" she asked. "Some of it," he answered. "The rest is either worse or better, depending on who tells the story." She asked whether the new roof above their heads had been paid for with clean money. He said the workers had been paid by a legitimate construction company that paid every tax it owed, then paused and continued that if she was asking about the life behind it, he wasn't going to sit there and tell her things that would keep her awake at night, because she didn't need them inside her head. "That isn't an answer," she said. "It's the most honest answer I have," he replied. Ophelia looked down at the glass of water, at her own hands, the hands that had baked cookies with her daughter in the kitchen 5 steps from that table, then raised her eyes again. "Then listen to my conditions," she said, and her voice didn't tremble, which surprised even her. "I'm not asking you to leave. You saved this shop, and my daughter cares about you, and I can't pretend that I want you to disappear. But your world, everything that exists beyond that door, cannot cross this threshold. Not your men, not your work, not your trouble. Inside this shop, your Uncle Dorian, the man who drinks espresso and teaches math with sugar cubes, nothing more. The day that can't remain true, don't come back." The room fell silent. Outside, a car passed, its headlights sweeping across the ceiling before fading away. Dorian looked at her for a long time, and this time, she didn't look away. She held his gaze, and at last he nodded, slowly and with enough weight to matter, then said, "Agreed." No oath, no grand words, only a single word. But it was placed on the table in the way a person might set down something precious. He stood, put on his coat, thanked her for the coffee, and walked toward the doorway. There, he stopped for half a second, with his back still turned to her, as though he meant to say something more, then chose not to, and stepped into the darkness. In the weeks that followed, Ophelia saw nothing change, and that was exactly how she knew he had kept his word in the manner of the world beyond the door. No one told her anything, but the contractor who had blocked the entrance to her shop with his truck every year suddenly began parking somewhere else and offered an awkward apology. The unfamiliar young men who lingered at the end of the street automatically crossed to the other side whenever they passed the Pearl's Corner sign, and the owner of the laundromat whispered that she had heard a spoken order had gone around the neighborhood: "Don't touch that shop." No matter who asked, the answer was always the same: "Don't touch that shop." And Dorian, on the nights when he left the coffee shop and returned to rooftop meetings and reports about shipments, stopped at the port, about a man named Vadim Orlov, who was pushing farther into Ferrante territory with every passing month like underground water eating away at the foundation of a house, began to understand one thing more clearly, though he told no one. The entire empire his father had left him, with all its buildings and bowed heads and rooms that fell silent whenever he entered, didn't contain a single square foot that made him want to remain for even 1 minute after the work was finished. But on the corner of a small street in Bridgeport, there were roughly 377 square feet, filled with the smell of coffee, where a child made him count sugar cubes, and a woman had dared push his money back toward him, the only place in the world where no one needed him to be Ferrante. And he realized he was arranging the schedule of an entire empire around a few afternoons spent sitting there. One Wednesday evening, early in the month, the familiar black sedan pulled up in front of the shop, but this time Dorian didn't get out alone. Mr. Aldo stepped out after him, slowly, one hand resting lightly against the car door frame. And when the two men entered the shop near closing time, Ophelia understood at once that this wouldn't be an ordinary evening of espresso. Maisie had been sleeping soundly in the back room since 8 o'clock. There were no customers left. Mr. Aldo chose the table near the wall where the photograph hung and sat down with the calm deliberation of a man who had already settled an important decision before arriving. And when Ophelia brought out tea, he invited her to join them with a gesture of his hand. Dorian sat beside him, unusually quiet, like a man who had come to bear witness rather than speak. "Miss Whittaker," the old man began, his voice slow and every word distinct, like someone reading from a statement carefully composed in his mind. "I'm 68 years old, and I've learned that some debts must first be repaid with words, or they can never be repaid with anything else. That rainy night, when I asked you about the photograph, I already knew the answer before you spoke." Ophelia set down her teacup. "You knew my grandmother?" she asked, though it wasn't truly a question. Mr. Aldo looked up at the photograph, at the silver-haired woman with her hair swept into a high bun behind the counter, and said that 50 years ago, this place wasn't called Pearl's Corner. It was simply the coffee shop that opened earlier than any other in Bridgeport, and its owner was a young woman with the kind of smile a person remembered for the rest of his life. It was a bitter, freezing night long ago, and 2 young men were running down this street in the dead of night, because behind them were men carrying iron clubs who meant to kill them over money they didn't have. One was 18 years old, thin as kindling, blood running from his forehead and soaking the collar of his shirt. The other was 20, carrying his friend's weight across his shoulders, knocking on every door along the street, and not one door opened, except one. He paused, took a sip of tea, and when he lowered the cup, his hand trembled very slightly. That woman opened her door at 3 o'clock in the morning for 2 bloodied strangers, pulled us inside, bolted the door, and switched off the lights at the front, he said. She cleaned the wound on my forehead with warm water, bandaged it with strips torn from a kitchen towel, cooked 2 bowls of soup, and made us finish every bite. We sat in the darkness of this room, right here, listening as the men hunting us ran past outside twice. And during all those hours, she didn't ask us even once who we were, what we had done, or why anyone was chasing us. Not once. At daybreak, she led us out through the back door, pressed a loaf of bread into each of our hands, and said only one thing. "Live decent lives, you two." Ophelia sat completely still. "I was the 18-year-old, Mr. Aldo said, and the 20-year-old who carried me that night was later known throughout this city by a surname people lowered their voices to speak. His name was Ferrante. He was the father of the man sitting beside me. The shop was so quiet that Ophelia could hear the old clock on the wall counting each second. She turned toward Dorian, and he nodded slowly, then said in a voice lower than usual that his father had told him that story only once, when he was 10 years old, and had made him promise that if he ever found that door again, he must remember what he owed it. "I grew up believing it was only a lesson meant to shape me," he said, "until the storm last month, when Mr. Aldo stood in front of your grandmother's photograph for so long, and the next morning, before he got into the car, he leaned close and whispered one sentence to me." Ophelia remembered that moment, the half-beat when Dorian's shoulders had gone still in the doorway, and she heard herself ask what Mr. Aldo had said. Dorian looked directly into her eyes. He said, "This is the place, son. This is the very door that opened." Mr. Aldo placed both of his aged hands on the tabletop and spoke the rest. "You didn't save us once, Miss Whitaker. Your family saved us twice, half a century apart. The same door, the same bloodline, the same refusal to ask questions. Your grandmother didn't know whose lives she spared that night, and you didn't know whom you sheltered from the rain. To me, that is no longer coincidence. It is a debt the Ferrante family has carried for generations, and fate itself has brought it back and laid it at your door." Ophelia rose slowly, walked to the wall, and looked up at the photograph of her grandmother for a long time, at that smile, at the hand resting on the brass machine, and for the first time, she understood why, on the night of the storm, when 16 drenched figures had stood outside her door, the answer had already been inside her before she had time to think. It had never been only her decision. It was something handed down through a blackboard, through slanted handwriting, through blood. "Grandma," she whispered, without sound, only a breath resting on her lips. And behind her, 2 men from the world beyond the door sat in silence, bowing their heads before the photograph of a woman who had sold coffee. About 7.5 miles north of Pearl's Corner, in an office on the 21st floor overlooking the Chicago River, Gordon Price was relearning an old lesson about his place in the food chain. For weeks, the Bridgeport neighborhood had whispered that the Price Company had fallen silent because it feared the dark shadow cast over the little coffee shop, but the truth was far uglier than that. Price had never been the one making the decisions. For 9 months, he had been gathering every building along that block, not for his own investment portfolio, but for a client who paid cash through 3 layers of shell companies, a man with a heavy accent and pale eyes named Vadim Orlov, who needed rows of aging buildings, restaurants, laundromats, and streams of small cash flowing day and night to turn dirty money from the port into clean money backed by receipts. The entire Bridgeport row was nearly complete, held up by only one missing link, a coffee shop of roughly 377 square feet, owned by a single mother who refused to sell. And when Price reported that the file on the shop had to be placed on hold, that a spoken order had spread throughout the neighborhood warning everyone not to touch that place. Orlov didn't erupt in anger as Price had feared. Instead, he sat in silence for a very long time, then smiled. And that smile sent a colder chill down Price's spine than any rage could have. To Orlov, the information was pure gold. For years, he had searched for a crack in the Ferrante family's armor and found none. The heir didn't gamble, didn't use drugs, didn't chase women, didn't make mistakes. A fortress without windows. Yet now that fortress had drawn a protective circle around a tiny coffee shop with no value at all on the board. And in the world of men like Orlov, anything guarded with such unreasonable care had to be the heart. Find your enemy's heart, he told his men in his native language, and half the war is already won. He no longer needed to take the shop. He needed to send a letter. The letter was delivered at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, while the Bridgeport street slept, and Pearl's Corner stood dark and empty, its doors locked as they were every night. No one was there. Ophelia was asleep in her apartment 4 blocks away, and in the next room, Maisie lay curled beneath her blanket with her one-eared teddy bear, unaware of anything. The fire alarm in the neighboring building began screaming at 3:17. The fire trucks arrived at 3:26, and by a little before 4 o'clock, it was all over. In both meanings of the phrase, Ophelia received the call at 4:10 from the laundromat owner's number, and the broken words forced their way through her sleep in a merciless order. Fire. Your shop. They put it out. Come now. She sent Maisie to the downstairs neighbor with the first lie she had told in years of motherhood, saying that Mommy had something to take care of at the shop early, so she should go back to sleep, then drove 4 blocks in her pajamas with an overcoat thrown on top, and stopped before what remained of one corner of her life. The fire hadn't consumed the entire shop. The firefighters had arrived in time, and the commander, carrying the smell of smoke from head to toe, explained in a tired, even voice that the flames had started near the back entrance, that there were signs of an accelerant, that the investigation team would take over, and that she shouldn't go inside yet. She listened to everything, nodded in the proper places, and signed where she was told. Then, when the red trucks had pulled away and the sidewalk held only her and a strip of yellow plastic tape, Ophelia stepped across it and entered her shop. The rear corner, where the little kitchen had once filled the air with the smell of chicken soup on the night of the storm, was now a silent mass of black. The wooden shelves twisted and bowed, the stove warped out of shape, half the wall stained as though an enormous hand had smeared charcoal across it. Water from the fire hoses pooled over the floor, reflecting the streetlight that entered through the window. The front of the shop remained untouched, the tables and chairs still arranged in straight lines, the new white ceiling, the new glass, all those nameless gifts still standing there, helpless, and somehow their wholeness hurt her more than the burned ruin behind them. She crossed the room as though walking through a stranger's home, and stopped before the wall where the photograph hung. Grandma Pearl's picture remained in its old place, the frame unburned, the glass unbroken, but smoke had laid a thin gray film of soot across its surface, thick enough that her grandmother's smile had become only a blurred shape behind it, as though seen through fog. Ophelia raised the sleeve of her overcoat and began to wipe. She wiped slowly in small circles, from her grandmother's face down to her shoulder, down to the hand resting on the brass machine, wiping as though cleaning away that layer of soot could somehow return everything to the way it had been, and her hand kept moving, wiping again and again, even after the glass was clear, even after her grandmother's smile had fully reappeared and was looking down at her as it had looked down at the 9-year-old child she once was. Then, without knowing when it happened, Ophelia's knees touched the wet floor. Ophelia Whitaker, who had remained standing through a collapsed marriage, through collection letters, through the 30-day deadline, through everything, knelt in her grandmother's smoke-stained coffee shop beneath the gray light before dawn, her shoulders trembling, and for the first time in this entire story, she allowed herself to fall apart, alone, where no one could see her, especially not her daughter. Dorian arrived at 7 o'clock in the morning. There was no convoy, no sound, only the soft opening of the shop door and the sight of him standing there in the doorway, looking inside. Ophelia had risen long before. She had washed her face with cold water in the restroom that remained untouched, tied back her hair, and was now gathering pieces of burned shelving into a garbage bag, like someone who needed to keep her hands and feet busy so her mind wouldn't begin to think. She heard the door, turned, and saw him. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He crossed the room slowly, his eyes passing over the part of the shop that remained intact, before stopping for a long time on the blackened corner of the kitchen, the stained wall, and the pool of water reflecting the morning light. And Ophelia, who had learned to read that face through so many afternoons of espresso, saw something there she had never seen before. It wasn't anger. Anger she could have endured. What appeared on Dorian Ferrante's face that morning was a silent and absolute condemnation of himself, the expression of a man who had just seen his own signature at the bottom of a sentence passed against someone else. "This wasn't an accident," she said, "and it wasn't a question." "No," he answered. She waited for him to say more, and he remained silent for a very long time, then said in a voice so low and level it was frightening, "You burned because of me." Ophelia opened her mouth, but he continued in that same voice. "They didn't burn this shop because of you. You've never had an enemy in your life. They burned it because it matters to me, because I was foolish enough to let the entire city see that it matters to me. As long as I keep walking through this door, it will keep burning." He paused, his gaze resting on the charred wood. "For your safety, I won't come back again." He spoke that final sentence the way a person closed a steel door, without raising his voice, without looking away, staring directly into her eyes, so she would understand that this wasn't something said in a moment of emotion. Ophelia stood still. 100 things rose inside her chest at once, that she had never asked him to protect her, that this was her shop, and she was the one who decided who could cross its threshold, that he had no right to be both the reason and the judge. But her throat closed, and the only thing that escaped was his name, spoken once, and he had already turned away. He paused for half a beat at the doorway, in the exact place where he had stopped on the night she gave him her conditions. And this time, just as before, he said nothing more and stepped outside. The black sedan pulled away from the street, leaving Ophelia standing alone in the middle of her smoke-stained shop. She took a deep breath, refusing to rely on his shadow or wait for hired help, fully determined to rebuild her grandmother's sanctuary with her own hands, her own savings, and her own sweat. She set to work. In the weeks that followed, Pearl's Corner remained temporarily closed, its freshly painted sign looking down over a locked door. Ophelia took a morning job at a bakery 6 blocks from home, picked up her daughter in the afternoon, and spent her evenings at the computer filling out loan applications, until she knew every box by heart. She told Maisie that the shop was being repaired, that the kitchen had broken, a truth trimmed down until it was small enough for a 7-year-old child, and Maisie accepted it as children accepted most things, until one evening, between a bowl of noodles and her handwriting workbook, she looked up and asked, "Where is Uncle Dorian, Mommy?" That was all. No whining, no tears, only a question as direct as all her questions were. And Ophelia sat there with a fork in her hand, opened her mouth, and found nothing at all. Not one lie good enough, not one truth gentle enough, so in the end, she only said that he was busy, and told her to eat before her food grew cold. And Maisie looked at her mother for another second, with eyes that understood more than they said, then lowered her head and continued eating, and she didn't ask again. It was the fact that she didn't ask again that followed Ophelia into her sleep. And on the other side of those nights, a black sedan, sometimes parked across the Bridgeport street very late, its lights turned off, sitting silently among the other cars. The man behind the steering wheel never got out. He only sat there, looking across at the dark Pearl's Corner sign, at the window that no longer glowed with warm yellow light, at the door he had closed against himself with his own hand, and inside the inner pocket of his suit jacket, still folded into quarters along its old creases, remained a child's drawing of a little house, a sky filled with blue rain, 16 smiling stick figures, and one blonde figure standing in the doorway, raising a hand to wave. He chose to fight this war in the shadows, resolving to remove the threat that had endangered her life once and for all. On a Monday morning near the end of the month, Ophelia Whittaker woke before her alarm, made a cup of coffee in the cramped kitchen of her apartment, sat down before the stack of papers on the dining table, and decided she was finished waiting. Waiting for the insurance money being held up because the investigation still hadn't been closed. Waiting for a second miracle from a man whose money she had pushed away. Waiting for grief to recede on its own. She was done with all of it. That afternoon, she put her car up for sale, the last valuable asset still in her name, and 3 days later it belonged to someone else, while she held an envelope of cash thicker than she had dared hope for. She carried that envelope, along with a handwritten business plan, to the community bank on the corner of 35th Street, sat across from a loan officer for an hour, presented every figure from the shop's long, proud years in business, and walked out with a small, legitimate loan, a fair interest rate, and her own signature on the papers, with no one standing behind her and no great hand sheltering her from above. Altogether, the money was only enough for the cheapest new kitchen and basic materials. It wasn't enough to pay workers, so she decided she would do whatever her own hands could manage, one day at a time, no matter how long it took. She was wrong about how long it would take. On the first Saturday morning, when she opened the shop with 2 buckets of paint and a wall scraper she had bought at a second-hand store, someone was already waiting outside. The retired electrician from the end of the street, who had once owed the shop an entire winter's worth of morning coffee after losing his job, arrived carrying his toolbox and announced that rewiring the kitchen was his responsibility, and she wasn't to argue. Then the husband and wife who owned the auto repair shop came with a floor sander. Then, the college student who always studied in the corner of the shop during exams arrived with 3 friends and 4 paintbrushes. The laundromat owner appeared at noon, carrying no paint and no tools, but bringing a pot of stew large enough to feed an army, which she placed on a table outside on the sidewalk before declaring that anyone who worked had to eat. For 2 weeks, Pearl's Corner rang with voices in a way it never had before, and Ophelia realized something that forced her to step behind the building for a while, until her eyes were dry again. For all those years, she had thought she was only selling coffee, letting people short on money at the end of the month put their orders on account, opening early so night shift workers could warm their hands, holding spare keys, accepting packages. Little things so ordinary that she did them and forgot them. It turned out that the neighborhood hadn't forgotten any of them. Not one person accepted $1 in wages. The only one who offered anything close to an explanation was the electrician, when Ophelia tried to push money into his coat pocket, and he brushed her hand away. Without looking up from the fuse box, he said that her grandmother had let him eat on credit through one bitter, unforgettable winter years ago, so by his calculations he was still paying off his debt, and she shouldn't ruin his bookkeeping. On the day the shop reopened, Maisie wrote the words, "We're back" in colored chalk, on the small board outside the door, and the first morning's crowd was so large that Ophelia had to make coffee with both hands, just as she had when Grandma Pearl still stood behind the counter. The new kitchen was smaller, the equipment cheaper, and the back corner wall still showed a darker shadow beneath the fresh paint, if anyone looked closely. But the shop was alive through clean money and her own sweat, and the hands of an entire street. And every time Ophelia passed the blackboard beneath her grandmother's photograph, the chalked words seemed to look back at her, no longer as a lesson, but as a confirmation. During those same weeks, the city beyond the door was moving in ways Bridgeport heard only as echoes. People whispered in the barber shop that the Ferrante family was cleaning up something large, that meetings were lasting through the night near the port, that several familiar names in that world had vanished from the city without saying goodbye, and that the Russians' men down by the docks had recently begun looking over their shoulders wherever they went. No one knew anything for certain. Ophelia listened to those fragments drift across the counter, as though hearing weather reports from a distant country, and reminded herself that none of it concerned her anymore, though at night there were moments when her hand lingered on the light switch longer than necessary. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, as she was turning the chairs upside down on the tables before closing, she looked through the window and saw him, Gordon Price, in the flesh, appearing on that street for the first time instead of hiding behind company letterhead, stood across the road in an expensive wool coat, with both hands in his pockets, staring at Pearl's Corner. He didn't cross the street. He didn't nod in greeting. He only stood there and watched, slowly and carefully, from the sign to the darkened windows, to the small wooden chalkboard hanging near the entrance, with the gaze of a man taking inventory of property. Then he checked his watch, turned away, and disappeared around the corner. Ophelia stood in the middle of the shop with a chair still in her hands, and that familiar metallic feeling, the one she had thought she had left behind in the ashes of the old kitchen, slowly began to rise again. 3 days later, during the dead hour around noon on a Tuesday, after the last customer of the morning had left and Maisie was sitting in her classroom about 2.5 miles away, the door of Pearl's Corner opened, and before Ophelia could clearly see their faces, she knew that the 3 men entering the shop hadn't come for coffee. The 2 men behind stopped beside the entrance, and one of them turned the sign to closed, with 2 practiced fingers. The man in front walked straight to the counter, removing his leather gloves one finger at a time, and Ophelia recognized those pale eyes from the fragments of description that had drifted across her counter during the past several weeks, though she had never seen him before. Vadim Orlov didn't introduce himself. He considered it self-evident that she knew who he was, and the frightening thing was that he was right. He placed a thin stack of papers bound in a blue cover on the counter, turned it neatly so it faced her, then set a black fountain pen beside it, his movements slow and orderly like those of a notary, and it was that very orderliness that made the air inside the shop turn thick. "Transfer agreement," he said, his heavy accent grinding against the consonants. 1.5 times market value. Funds transferred today. You sign the last page. Ophelia didn't touch the papers. He watched her for a moment, then continued without raising his voice, and because of that, every word fell like a stone dropped into water. "I'm a patient man, Miss Whitaker, but last time it was only one corner of the kitchen. Next time," he said, tilting his head slightly toward the shop, "it won't stop at one corner." Beneath the counter, Ophelia's hand was trembling. She knew it clearly. She could feel every tremor traveling up toward her elbow. But when she opened her mouth, her voice came out straight and whole, as though it belonged to someone steadier than she was, or to a woman who had stood behind this very counter half a century earlier. "My grandmother opened this shop to people who were being hunted," she said, looking directly into those pale eyes. "I won't close it because of the hunter." Something passed briefly across Orlov's face, not quite anger, closer to the curiosity of a cat watching prey that refused to run, and he pushed the pen another inch toward her, and at that exact moment, the back door of the shop opened. There was no crash of a door being kicked in, no shouted warning, only the soft creak of hinges, then footsteps, and Dorian Ferrante entered the shop with Bull following behind him like a wall that had learned to move. The two men by the front entrance froze. Their hands began to move, then stopped halfway when Bull merely looked at them, and the entire shop fell into a silence stretched as tight as the skin of a drum. Dorian didn't look at Ophelia. He walked to the counter, stopped exactly an arm's length from Orlov, and placed a file on the wooden surface beside the blue-covered agreement, 3 times as thick, bound in gray, its corners curled from being read so often. He turned it neatly toward Orlov, repeating every movement the man had just made with Ophelia, a polite and merciless imitation. "Open it," he said. Orlov didn't. His pale eyes moved over the unmarked cover, then his fingers lifted one corner of the file, one page, then another, and Ophelia, standing behind the counter, saw something she had believed she would never witness. She saw the color literally drain from a man's face. "Gordon Price's records," Dorian said, his voice as even as though he were reading a menu. 9 months of property purchases in Bridgeport, 3 layers of shell companies, every stream of money from the port flowing through every name, every signature. "I have the originals." He paused, allowing the clock on the wall to count out 3 full seconds, then finished. "Copies have been sitting on the desk of the FBI's Chicago office since 6 o'clock this morning, along with the name of a witness who has become extremely cooperative. You know Price. He has just discovered that he fears prison more than he fears you." Orlov stood motionless. No one inside the shop moved. Then Dorian leaned forward half an inch, just enough to make the next words belong only to him, though the room was so quiet that Ophelia still heard every one of them. "Touch this shop one more time, and what burns will be the 20-year RICO sentence waiting for you, and I'll stand outside and watch it burn to the ground." Time inside the shop seemed to tighten beneath an invisible hand. Orlov looked at the gray file, then at Dorian. His pale eyes swept across Ophelia one final time, and there was no cat left in that gaze now, only a man calculating the nearest way out. He closed the blue-covered agreement, picked it up with the fountain pen, and returned both to the inside pocket of his coat with the same precise orderliness with which he had taken them out, as though clearing away a ruined game of chess. He spoke one brief sentence in his native language, more to himself than to anyone else, then turned and walked toward the door. The 2 shadows near the entrance slipped out after him, and the little bell above the door rang with a brightness so out of place in that atmosphere that it felt almost indecent. Through the window, Ophelia watched the 3 men cross the street, climb into a gray car, and disappear from her block. Then her knees weakened, and she had to brace herself against the counter, and when she looked up, Dorian was still standing there on the other side of the wood, in the exact place where a customer would stand, not taking even one step closer, only asking very softly whether she was all right. And Ophelia, with both hands still trembling against the counter, heard herself answer with the question she had carried through all those weeks when the shop stood dark. You were always nearby, weren't you? The question she asked that day never received a complete answer. Only the faintest nod before he and Bull left through the back door, as quietly as they had arrived. And then 2 weeks passed, and the real answer came to Ophelia through the television screen in her living room on a Thursday evening. The 9 o'clock news opened with aerial footage of federal vehicles crowding the street outside an office building by the river and a warehouse complex near the port, while the anchor read 2 names she knew far too well: Gordon Price, 55 years old, a real estate businessman, and Vadim Orlov, 48, accused of leading a federal money laundering operation, facing dozens of charges after a coordinated investigation lasting several months, with more arrests expected to follow. Ophelia remained seated for a long time after the broadcast had moved on to the weather forecast, and in the next room, Maisie was reading a comic book, knowing nothing and needing to know nothing. Outside, Bridgeport absorbed the news in its own way. The barber shop and laundromat whispered about it all week, and in the deeper levels of the city, where news didn't travel through television screens but through brief telephone calls, people drew their own conclusion. No one should be foolish enough to go near that little coffee shop on the corner, not because they feared bloodshed as they once had, but because the man who had tried had been buried beneath a mountain of his own paperwork, legally, cleanly, without a single bullet fired, and that kind of punishment frightened the underworld more than any of the old methods, because it showed that whoever stood behind that shop had learned how to win with a law from which no one could appeal. But the man standing behind it didn't return to the shop. He didn't come on the crowded day it reopened. He didn't come on the day Maisie added the word forever after "we're back" on the chalkboard. Strangers sat at the corner table, and Ophelia caught herself looking toward it more often than she wanted to admit. What she didn't know was that across the city, in an office high above the streets where stacks of transfer documents were steadily growing, Dorian Ferrante was dismantling his father's legacy one piece at a time, selling off the businesses that could never be made clean, folding those that could into tax-paying companies, signing papers that made the family's elderly advisors remove their glasses and wipe the lenses after reading them. And whenever Bull asked whether he was certain, Dorian gave only one answer: "I won't bring the old world to that doorway ever again." He believed he had lost the right to cross that threshold on the night the kitchen corner burned, and no document could sign that right back into his hands. And there was something else Ophelia didn't know, something that had been moving beneath the surface of this entire story since the morning after the storm. The nod Dorian gave Bull in the doorway that day, the nod so brief she mistook it for a farewell, had never been a farewell. It was an order, given immediately after Mr. Aldo leaned close and whispered about the door that had opened 50 years earlier, and it contained only 4 words: "Find that coffee machine." Bull began that very week. The name Harold Bishop led to a mansion in the northern suburbs, where the butler explained that his employer had sold off most of his collection long ago, and that the brass coffee machine had been included in an auction lot sent to Milwaukee 18 months earlier. From Milwaukee, the trail shattered into 9 dead ends spread across 3 states, illegible handwritten invoices, an antiques dealer who had died, a warehouse that had changed ownership 3 times, and telephone calls that ended with the same answers: "I don't remember. I don't know. Don't call again. Someone else might have stopped." But the order had no expiration date. So on a rainy day the previous month, Toby, 23 years old and seemingly incapable of growing tired, drove 6 hours to a closed auction house outside Milwaukee, persuaded the elderly manager to let him into the basement archive, and spent 2 full days among damp cardboard boxes, turning every paper receipt by hand until he found a faded line of ink listing an item: Italian coffee machine, brass, heavily damaged, sold to a private restoration workshop, followed by a name and an address all the way in Seattle. Gus Barlow. The first call to the workshop was made that same evening, and when the old man on the other end heard the description of the curving pipes and the small eagle cast into the top of the machine, he fell silent for a long time, then said in the voice of someone who had been waiting years to be asked about it, "Hold on, let me go take a look," followed by the sound of footsteps, the opening of a storage door, and when his voice returned, he asked only one question: "Who are you people? And why are you looking for this old lady?" On Saturday morning 2 weeks later, in the middle of the busiest hour, a small faded blue truck pulled up in front of Pearl's Corner, and from the driver's seat stepped an old man with white hair wearing a plaid flannel shirt, while from the passenger side jumped a face, Ophelia recognized immediately, despite the months that had passed, Toby, grinning from ear to ear and waving at her through the window as though greeting family. She went to open the door with a cleaning cloth still draped over her shoulder, and before she could ask anything, the old man extended his hand and introduced himself as Gus Barlow, a restorer from Seattle, apologizing for arriving without warning but saying that some deliveries shouldn't be announced beforehand. Then the two men opened the back of the truck, loosened the straps, and carried down onto the sidewalk a crate as tall as a man's chest, wrapped in gray moving blankets and secured with broad bands. The customers inside began turning to look. Maisie squeezed her way out to stand beside her mother, and when the final gray blanket fell away, the Bridgeport street on that Saturday morning suddenly became completely silent. The Vittoria stood there beneath the sunlight, made of brass, gleaming like a musical instrument. Its curved pipes exactly as they appeared in the photograph on the wall, the small eagle spreading its wings at the top, and Ophelia stood motionless on the sidewalk, unaware of when the cloth had slipped from her shoulder. Mr. Barlow rested one hand against the side of the machine as though placing it on the shoulder of an old friend, and said that he had kept the old lady in his workshop for nearly a year and a half, having bought her in Milwaukee in a condition most people would have called scrap metal, and though the restoration had been finished long ago, he hadn't been able to bring himself to sell her, almost as though he had known he was holding her for someone. He pointed to a faint, long scratch along the machine's left side near the handle. "I left this mark untouched," he said. "The machine knows its own history. It doesn't need to be erased." Then he reached into the breast pocket of his shirt, took out an envelope, handed it to her, and said that what was inside would explain more clearly than he could. Ophelia opened the envelope right there on the sidewalk, surrounded by customers who had spilled out through the doorway, and began to read. The letter was handwritten in the careful script of an old man and told of a telephone call months earlier, asking about a brass machine with an eagle on top, of the people who had followed the old lady's trail through 3 states and 9 dead ends, of a young man who had spent 2 days in a basement turning over every paper receipt by hand, and of how it had all begun, according to what they had told him, with a single nod on a stormy night in Chicago. No names were written anywhere in the letter. None were needed. Ophelia reached the final line, and the hands holding the letter slowly rose until she covered her face with it, and with her palms, her shoulders going still there in her grandmother's shop, before her grandmother's machine, while no one in the crowd said a word. Maisie was the one who saw him first. The little girl was standing beside the machine when her eyes caught a familiar figure across the street, where the black sedan had been parked for who knew how long, and the man in the charcoal gray suit had already crossed the road but had stopped at the shop's threshold, on the exact stone where her mother had once stood on the night of the storm, standing there without stepping inside, his hands resting at his sides like a man who wasn't certain he was allowed to enter. Maisie saw nothing complicated about any of it. She ran outside, took that large hand in both of hers, and pulled, saying loudly enough for the whole shop to hear, "Why are you standing outside? Uncle Dorian, come in. Mommy is about to make coffee with Great-Grandma Pearl's machine." And Dorian Ferrante, the man before whom no door in the city dared remain closed, allowed a 7-year-old child to lead him across the threshold of a coffee shop. Ophelia lifted her eyes to him through the tears still gathered there. For a while, no one spoke. Then she turned away, not to hide her face, but toward the machine, scooped freshly ground coffee, pressed it down, locked the handle into place, and performed each movement her grandmother had taught her 20 years earlier, with hands that were trembling, and beneath her touch, the Vittoria awakened with a sigh of steam that everyone in the shop could hear, and the first stream of espresso in 3 years flowed into a white cup, rich and slow. She placed that cup in front of Dorian. He looked at it, then at her, and said softly, "I didn't come back to ask for anything. I only wanted to see it return to where it belonged." She shook her head, a tired and steady movement, then said, "I never needed you to be perfect, Dorian. I only needed to know which side of the door you chose to stand on." He remained silent for a long time. Then he told her, briefly and without embellishment, about the transfer documents, the businesses he had sold, the companies that now paid taxes, and the clean road he was leading the Ferrante name onto one step at a time. "My father owed this shop his life," he said at last, his eyes never leaving hers. "I owe it a different life, and I came here to begin repaying that debt." Ophelia looked at him for another moment, then nudged the cup 1 inch closer and said, "Drink it before it gets cold." And inside that small coffee shop crowded with people on that Saturday morning, Beneath the photograph of a woman smiling beside her brass machine, Dorian lifted the cup, took his first sip, and closed his eyes for 1 second, like a man who had finally come home. 1 year later, on a Saturday afternoon, in early autumn, Pearl's Corner was so crowded that the bell above the door hardly stopped ringing. Regular customers filled every wooden table. The rich scent of roasted coffee drifted all the way onto the sidewalk, and in the most honored place in the shop, directly beneath the photograph of Grandma Pearl, now set inside a new wooden frame, the brass Vittoria worked throughout the day as though it had never spent a single day away, steam rising around the small eagle each time Ophelia pulled the brewing lever. Beside it, the blackboard still carried the old words written in chalk. The measure of a person's heart is how they treat someone who can never repay them. Carefully retraced whenever the lettering began to fade, except now 2 different hands took turns renewing it, one belonging to Ophelia and the other, more uneven one, belonging to Maisie. The man in the charcoal gray suit had become such a familiar part of the street that no one lowered their voice when speaking of him anymore. Bridgeport, a neighborhood that had little interest in powerful family names, referred to him by a simple title of its own making: the coffee shop owner's future husband, though in truth, no proposal had taken place until that Saturday afternoon. It happened near closing time, after the final customers had gone and only 3 people remained inside the shop. Ophelia was polishing the Vittoria with a soft cloth as part of her closing ritual. Maisie sat on a high stool finishing her homework, and Dorian rose from his familiar corner table, walked to the counter, and placed a small box on the wooden surface, already open, holding a ring that was surprisingly simple compared with anything people might have imagined from the Ferrante name. But he didn't look at Ophelia first. He turned toward the 8-year-old girl sitting on the stool, waited until she lifted her eyes from her workbook, and asked in the most serious voice he possessed, "Maisie, may I have your permission to stand on the inside of this door forever?" Maisie looked at him, looked at the ring, then looked at her mother, who stood motionless with the soft cloth still in her hand. Then the little girl gave one firm nod, like someone stamping an important document, and said, "I agree, but you have to promise that you'll keep teaching me math." "I promise," he said. And when he turned toward the woman behind the counter, he didn't need to ask another question, because Ophelia had already set down the cloth, already walked around the counter that had witnessed everything, and her nod came at the same moment her arms went around him. That evening, the 3 of them closed the shop together, following the exact order Grandma Pearl had established decades earlier. They turned the chairs upside down on the tables, wiped the counter, checked the kitchen, and finally switched off the lights, 1 row at a time from the back of the shop toward the front, leaving the small light above the photograph and the brass machine until last. And when the door closed behind those 3 people, the Pearl's Corner sign stood quietly beneath the streetlights, waiting to open again with the arrival of a new morning. Dear friends, the story of Ophelia and Dorian ends there, but what it leaves behind remains open, just like the door of that little coffee shop. True kindness has never been a transaction. It is a door we open without knowing where it may lead. And sometimes, like the seed Grandma Pearl planted on a snowy night long ago, it travels silently across 2 generations, before returning at the very moment our children and grandchildren need it most. This story also reminds us that the person who appears most frightening isn't always the one who poses the greatest danger, while the one smiling politely inside an elegant suit may be the person carrying the storm, so we shouldn't hurry to close a door on someone simply because of the way they look. Because respecting another human being, offering them shelter, a bowl of hot soup, or a little kindness without conditions, may become the greatest and most enduring investment we ever make, one whose interest no bank could ever calculate. If today's story has touched your heart, please click like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with those who still believe in kindness, so that each day we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories. And what about you? How did this story make you feel? Have you ever opened a door for someone during the stormiest night of their life? Or has someone ever opened a door for you? Please share the feelings from deep within your heart in the comments, because we truly read and cherish every word you write. Thank you for staying with this story until its final moment. We wish everyone watching this video strong health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. And may each of us always keep a door within our hearts ready to open for someone else. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.